Hello students, we discussed in our last lecture the features of the literary theory and criticism, and in this sense we are going to study the classicism. Classicism, it stands for the ancient time or in the classical period. So that is what we need to think about classicism in a general term. Anything that is produced by these classical authors will be considered their opinion aligned with the classical philosophy. The literary theory and criticism brings us these features that we see are propounded by the classical theorists in their respective work of arts or treatises or dissertations. So, classicism, in a general term, characterized the features, and these features that we are going to discuss here. These features will help you to understand more over about the theory. But we have the different regional theories, and that we see in the Greek classical literary criticism. Ancient Greek literary criticism had its origin in Greek poetry, and Greek poetry reached to the highest point during the time of Homer. Homer was a celebrated author who wrote the greatest epic in Greek language. Homer wrote Iliad and Odyssey. He was respected for his composition and skilled composition. His only part of poetry is the Greek education, shaped his taste and attitude towards the Greek people. In his poetry, we have earliest mention of nature of poetry means nature of literature and function of poetry म्हणजे function of literature. हे आपल्याला समजून घ्यावं लागेल. आणि म्हणून आपण जे फर्स्ट सेमेस्टरमध्ये नेचर अँड फंक्शन ऑफ लिटरेचर बघितलं त्या संदर्भात पहिल्यांदा होमरने आपल्या ह्या पोएट्रीमध्ये लिहिलेलं आहे. होमरच्या कविता आपल्याला ग्रीक लेजंड इन हिरोज जे भूतकाळामध्ये होऊन गेले त्यांच्या बाबतीत प्रफाऊंड अशा पद्धतीचं वर्णन करून सांगतात. हेझोएट नावाचा एक पीझंट कवी होता, शेतकरी कवी होता 7व्या सेंचुरी बिफोर ख्राइस्ट. ओके, आणि त्याने होमरच्या थीम काही घेतल्या, इन्स्पायर झाला हेझिओइडने आणि त्याने इन्स्पिरेशन पर असं लिहिलेलं आहे. अँड ही बिलीव्ड ऑन द ग्रीक म्यूज म्हणजे कवितेची देवता. ती ग्रीक मायथॉलॉजीमध्ये ती एक कवितेची देवता आहे ज्यामुळे कवीला लेखकाला लिहिण्यासाठी प्रेरणा मिळते किंवा कलाकारांना कला दाखवण्यासाठी प्रेरणा मिळते. अशी म्यूजवर किंवा ग्रीक मायथॉलॉजीवर त्यांचा विश्वास असतो. अँड दिस वॉज ऑल्सो अ काइंड ऑफ अ होमर्स आयडिया ऑफ पोएटिक क्रिएशन. पिंडार जो 5th सेंचुरीमध्ये बिफोर ख्राइस्ट 5th सेंचुरीमध्ये त्यांनी थीम ऑफ इमॉर्टॅलिटी जी होमरपासून घेतली त्याच्यावर त्याने लिहिलं. पिंडारला माणसाचं मृत होणं, मृत्यू येणं ही माहिती आहे माणसाच्या जीवनामध्ये, पण कवी आणि कविता त्याला इमॉर्टल बनवते हे आपल्याला पाहायला मिळतं. त्याच्या कविता हे रिफ्लेक्ट करतात का कवीच्या मृत्यूनंतरसुद्धा कविता लिटरेचर जिवंत राहतं. आणि पिंडाच्या ओढ हे आपल्याला निगोशिएट करताना पाहायला मिळतं. आणि म्हणून अलॉंग विथ द थीम ऑफ इमॉर्टॅलिटी, truth was another concern that we see. From Homer onwards, poets claimed that they had special knowledge given by the muses. Their poetry could tell the truth about human life, and it is notable that the power of poets was not limited to the expression of a truth alone. They were also believed to have the opposite power of misrepresenting and manipulating truth. म्युझेस जे ग्रीक मायथॉलॉजीमध्ये आहे ते पोएटमध्ये क्रिएटिव्ह नॅरेटिव्ह इन्व्हेंट करण्याचं काम करत असतात. Therefore, they have power to excite emotions. This manipulation of truth showed the poet's ability to recreate, giving him semi divine status, but also invited severe criticism from the philosophers like Plato. Poet's ability to manipulate truth had so many implications for the future course of both literary and critical development. We can learn from the great points about the poetic gift and craft of the poetry. See, so classical theory brings us these reflections. Poetry is inspired by the muses. This means that it has its own origin in divine power. This takes us to the important concerns of the criticism, the process of poetic creation, and how poetry is created because of divine inspiration, muses. It's a poet's gift and craft that makes the poetry. Furthermore, classicism believed that poetry expresses truth, and for the Greek poets, truth lay in the inspiration from the muses. Their poetry somewhat offered wisdom and at the same time guide people. They believed that the poetry guide people to live their life, means to teach the morality. Such claims were challenged by sophists, but they introduced the mimesis and they introduced the falsity of the poetry. Sophist, the school of poetry, but it initiated the debate. Furthermore, poetry excites our emotions. It means that poetry affects human emotions and passions, so it has a great affective value. And this refers to two important aspects: moving power of poetry and the relation of the poetry to the readers. Poetry was supposed to give the pleasure, to arouse the emotions. So this might be called as a function of poetry, function of literature. These themes give light to some abiding concerns that literary criticism deals with. The relation between ethics and poetry, the relation between writer and his work, relation of the work with the world. So these themes are explored in the theory of imitation and theory of representation. This background information about the status of poetry adds something to the poetry, and it is nothing other but the reality and at the same time representation of the poetry. See, we have seen this representation may be social or cultural. It was through the poetry that criticism developed in Greece. In its earliest form, the crucial reason for this was that Greek poetry was self reflective and contained its own criticism within itself. It might be therefore argued that the poets were the earliest critics and that concerns of the poets concerns with the criticism. The concerns of poets were not literary or aesthetic matters, but moral authority and ethical value. They regarded poetry and morality as intimately related. So the focus of inquiry is not the literary, but it turns out to morality means it turns out to be philosophical. जेव्हा साहित्य नैतिक दृष्टिकोनातून विचार करतं आणि नैतिकतेच्या दृष्टिकोनातून काय आयुष्यासाठी उपयोगाचं आहे हा विचार करतं तेव्हा साहित्य हे फिलॉसॉफिकल बनतं. So the rise of prose in the 5th century changed the status and priorities of the poetry, by extension, and of literary criticism. But sophists who raised certain doubts and changed the nature of poetry and criticism. But now, poetry was not taught for its own sake. It is taught to improve the speech of the aspiring orators in the assemblies and law courts. Poetry came to serve as oratory. The art of poetry began to diminish because of rhetoric taking over poetry. Prose posing a stiff challenge. The term rhetoric means the art of speech, an art concerned with the use of public speaking. It is used as a to convince people. Rhetoric in poetry or rhetorical poetry became more important and literary criticism became less important. It was not only prose and rhetoric that challenged the supremacy of poetry, but philosophy also raised doubts about morality and truthfulness of poetry. Xenophanes in 6th century BC criticized epic poetry on moral grounds. He argued that Homer and Hesiod had attached shameful things like theft and adultery and deceit to the gods in their poetry. But false to gods could have corrupt and adverse effects on readers. But they propounded these views, and these views were somewhat brought by Plato too, so that he criticized the poets as a liar. See, we have seen the poetry, as we have seen this particular part, in 450 to 385, Aristophanes also lived there. He wrote comic plays. He also commented on the nature and function of poetry through classical perspective. And they are important because they discuss role and responsibility of the poetry. His famous play Frogs represents literary history. They have taken he has taken the critical contest between two playwrights, Euripides and Aeschylus. Aeschylus represented old values, but Euripides was progressive in his views. So this debate a kind of a language that is used. The playwright should use enigmatic choices. Duty of poetry is to teach values, virtues, provide guidelines. Both agree that role of poetry is to teach the people morality and offer role models. But they disagree on many other issues and find faults with each other's use of language and poetry. This poetry acts on these lines. Leontini is also one of the rhetoricals born from Sicily. He also commented on the use of poetry as in his nature and function of poetry. He defined as prose, he equaled prose with poetry. Poetry as in speech, in meter. So his ability of speech to arouse emotions compared with effects of speech on the minds of those of drugs on the body, he compared with that. It brings a kind of effect. It gives the pleasure, pain. Poetry was also thought to have similar effects on the readers, and his views were mostly antithetical to Plato's view. It could be observed that the influence Plato's approach to poetry. Plato's analysis had the bad effects on poetry. Georgian's emphasis on emotions like pity and fear. It was anticipated by Aristotle's association of emotions with tragedy. Next, we have Plato. Plato was a critic of poetry. His very basic and enduring questions about nature and function of poetry based on just like a sophist. He found poetry to be false and imitative. He found emotionally exciting and morally corrupting. He found poetry to be inconducive to his ideal state. He put his views in Ion and Republic. Socrates tells the rhapsode that the poet composes in a feat of divine inspiration of muses, not through his talent and ability. Words he calls poets are inspired and irrational. So, in the Republic, Plato deals intensely and elaborately with poetry. He treats philosophically, but to some extent ideologically. His aim was to replace poetry with philosophy. He proposes theory of mimesis in his book Thought. But Plato divides literature into kind of two kinds of narration, means narrative and imitative. He does not criticize poetry, but expects a deep involvement of the actor. So in book 10th of Republic, the tone and theme changes completely and he declares poetry to be a false. In order to support his critique, he has provided certain arguments and he shows that poetry falls short of standard reality. Plato's physical world is not independent or self sustained, it depends upon another world of ideas. This ideal world is accessible only to reason and not to physical sense of perception. In other words, the objects in the physical world get their essence and qualities from the ideal world. Plato gives the example of the bed to substantiate his central point. A carpenter makes the bed out of the concept in his mind. So, the physical world is not perfect, it's only a copy of the bed in the world forms. Poetry, like bed in the physical world, depends on the ideal world, and which is not a reality. Ideal world is not a reality, and that is what he poet imitates the ideal, not the reality. So he then criticizes the emotive power of poetry, appealing their emotions and does not improve them morally. So it evokes the emotions and passions which weakens the reasoning power. It's a harmful and it's corrupt. So poets should be banished because they tells the lies and falsity based on not a standard reality. And these are the ways he criticized the poetry as per Plato. So, in today's lecture, we have discussed about these few classical trends. You have to listen carefully to understand the true features, characteristics of the classicism. In our next video lecture, we are going to study the Aristotle's views on the theory of poetry. Thank you.